Truth is stranger than fiction, or so the old adage goes. It certainly rings true in the tragic yet curious tale of a road crash in Indiana, which killed 5 people, all affiliated to Taylor University. It's a tragedy that still provokes strong emotions years later among all those connected to the devastating events. 5 students and 4 university staff were all traveling home in a school minivan on the evening of April 26, 2006. The group of 9 had been returning from Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is about 55 miles north of Upland, the town where Taylor University is situated. The university had a campus in Fort Wayne at the time. The Taylor van was traveling south along Interstate 69. As the clock ticked past 8 p.m., the group found themselves just a couple miles shy of the exit for Marion, meaning they weren't far from home now. However, it was at that moment that tragedy struck. For reasons that only became apparent after the event, a truck had crossed the central reservation and was heading straight for the Taylor University van. There was nothing the minivan driver could do to avoid the collision. The result was fatal for 5 of the 9 passengers on board. Among the dead was listed a member of the Taylor University staff, Monica Felver. The crash also resulted in the reported deaths of 4 young students, Brad Larson, Laurel Erb, Betsy Smith, and Whitney Sirac, as well as 3 further members of staff. 1 student named Laura Van Ryn had survived the impact, yet she'd suffered sickening injuries. The scene that emergency responders came across that fateful night was heartbreaking. It was also chaotic, with passengers and contents of the van spread out across the road. While the survivors were given life-saving care, the response team also tried desperately to identify the victims of the crash. Van Ryn of Caledonia, Michigan had suffered life-threatening head injuries, which were quickly bandaged by emergency workers. Her identity card was located and kept with her. The university senior, who was 22 years old at the time, was then taken to hospital immediately. She was in an unconscious state. The deceased were removed from the scene, and as the usual practice, family members were informed. Identification cards and eyewitness statements had been taken at the scene, so in-person identification was not in fact required. Whitney Sirac's family declined to formally identify their daughter, most probably too distraught to face the prospect of looking at her injuries firsthand. Whitney Sirac was 18 years old and a native of Gaylord, Michigan. She was a freshman at Taylor. Her parents were devastated at the news that their daughter had been killed in the crash. They began the heartbreaking task of planning their daughter's funeral. Days later, an estimated 1,400 people attended that funeral, with Sirac's sister providing the eulogy. Meanwhile, Van Ryn's family were summoned to her hospital bed. The young woman had suffered terrible injuries that had left her in a state akin to a coma. She was unable to communicate with those around her. In addition, her face was bandaged and badly swollen. It was difficult even for her closest loved ones to recognize her. Understandably, the crash sent shockwaves through the Taylor community. As president of the university, much responsibility fell on the shoulders of Eugene Habecker to lead his staff and students through the traumatic aftermath. Habecker also offered support to the families of the deceased and injured. Habecker went to the hospital to visit Van Ryn, who was still unresponsive. He offered comfort to the girl's parents, Don and Susie. Her head was fully bandaged, and she, of course, was still unconscious. Habecker recalled to the TV news station Fox 59 back in 2016. "I asked Don if I could hold Laura's hand and pray for her," the university president added. What all those connected to the events were continually asking themselves, and each other, was why? What had the semi-trailer truck been doing on the wrong side of the road? Crash investigators interviewed the driver of the vehicle and soon ascertained that Robert F. Spencer of Canton, Michigan, had fallen asleep at the wheel. That was the reason his truck had veered onto the wrong side of I-69. Spencer had also provided false details in the lead up to the crash. He'd actually been driving for 9 hours longer than permitted under federal law without taking a significant break, doctoring his time logs to disguise that fact. He was subsequently charged with 5 counts of reckless homicide. The victims' families were further devastated by this news. "1 second of him falling asleep and we'll suffer for the rest of our lives," said the daughters of Taylor University staff member Monica Felver in a joint statement. Spencer showed remorse for his actions. "I know I'll have to deal with this the rest of my life," the truck driver said at his sentencing. Spencer was eventually sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the accident. He actually spent 2 of those 4 years behind bars. Yet years later, Jeff Larson, whose brother Brad was killed in the crash, said he'd found forgiveness for Spencer. Over the last several years, my heart's been drawn to respond with forgiveness, Larson told Fox 59 in 2016. While the families were able to discover the reason for the crash, it didn't change the fact that their loved ones were gone. And the surviving student still had a significant fight on her hands to recover from the sickening injuries that she'd sustained in the crash. Fortunately, as time passed, the young woman began to slowly improve. Lisa Van Ryn, Laura's sister, had decided to keep a blog of her sister's recovery. The blog was intended to update friends, family, and other Taylor University students of Van Ryn's treatment in progress. It was also a place where well-wishers could offer their prayers for the stricken university senior. On May 29th, Lisa offered an update. While certain things seem to be coming back to her, she still has times where she'll say things that don't make any sense, wrote Van Ryn's sister. Slowly but surely, the student was regaining consciousness and the ability to communicate, which was, of course, wonderful news for her family. The recovering crash victim was also beginning to be able to whisper, but some of the things she said continued to make no sense to her carers and her own family. 5 weeks after she was admitted to hospital with the serious injuries that she'd sustained in the road crash, an unbelievable discovery was made. When hospital staff had been calling Van Ryn by her name, she'd been responding in a barely audible whisper with another. Then one day, as part of her recovery, Van Ryn was asked to write her name, but she didn't write Laura. She wrote Whitney instead. The young woman in the hospital bed was not Laura Van Ryn at all. It was Whitney Sirach. The two women looked remarkably similar, from the color and length of their hair to their complexion and height. But this was 5 weeks later. How had no one known that this was all a case of mistaken identity? And the body laid to rest all those weeks earlier at the memorial service had not been Sirach at all, but Laura Van Ryn. The wrong ID had been affixed to the body of Laura Van Ryn at the crash scene, according to Fox 59. That's why authorities had believed all along that the body was that of Whitney Sirach. And as for the woman in the hospital, her head injuries had been so severe that the mistake was not realized for 5 long weeks. Carly Sirach, Whitney's sister, took over the blog post originally started by Lisa Van Ryn to offer her family side of events. I did not believe my sister was in the hospital. I thought for sure this was a mistake. When I walked into the hospital room, I was shocked and overcome with joy, wrote Carly. It was an incredible moment for the family. Yet it was a situation also heavily tinged with sadness for the Van Ryns. Soon after we saw Whitney, our family met with the Van Ryns, and our joy for ourselves was pushed aside by the pain we felt for them. It's hard because our joy is their pain, Carly Sirach added. Van Ryn's mother, Susie, summed up her feelings. Well, it was hard, but we knew where our daughter was, and we knew that Newell and Colleen needed to know where their daughter was. Van Ryn's mother told TV news show Today. It was still a tragedy, despite the joy felt by the Sirachs. On top of losing their daughter, some reactions to the event were also distressing for the Van Ryns. In particular, there was the oft-repeated question, how did you not realize it wasn't your daughter in the hospital bed? Yet a psychiatrist has stated that it's conceivable under the circumstances how such events could play out. The family members, they're being told by the authorities that it is in fact their daughter. Richard McNally, a psychiatry professor at Harvard University, told the New York Times newspaper in 2006. The person in the hospital is rather badly banged up and bruised, and they might conceivably accept that verdict from the authorities, added Professor McNally. Others have asked how it's possible that the body of what turned out to be Laura Van Ryn was never positively identified. Yet this practice isn't uncommon. As Dr. Tim Palmbach, a forensic scientist, told the New York Times, sure, in hindsight, we can say that an autopsy should have been done, but usually if it's clear that the deceased wasn't the driver, an autopsy isn't done, he continued. Unsurprisingly, the story received widespread media attention. Events were covered in a special episode of Dateline NBC, while they also featured on both The Oprah Winfrey Show and Today. There have also been works of fiction based on the subject matter, including episodes of both CSI New York and House MD. As terrible as the tragedy was, with the pain for the two families only heightened by the misidentification of the body, lessons have been learned. Back in 2006, state coroners in Indiana used a system known as presumptive evidence to identify bodies. According to Tony Cirillo, who's the training director at the coroner's training board in the state. This step was then followed up for scientific findings. That meant that the evidence needed to identify the body at the time of the crash consisted with a regular form of ID, such as a driver's license. The wrong ID had been associated with Van Ryn at the crash site, and then Sirach's family declined to view the body of what they thought was their daughter. Further steps to confirm identity, such as DNA testing for example, were only performed at the coroner's discretion. In this case, the coroner involved decided against this course of action. And of course, Sirach was so badly injured that Van Ryn's family couldn't discern that the person lying in the hospital bed was not their daughter. It was a terribly unfortunate series of events that led to the case of mistaken identity. As a result, this system of coroner's discretion has been abolished in Indiana. Family identification and/or scientific evidence is now required for all suspicious or unnatural deaths. The two girls' home state of Michigan has enacted similar changes. It may be of little comfort to the family of Van Ryn, but at least another Indiana or Michigan family need never go through the same emotional turmoil as they did in the aftermath of the terrible crash on I-69. But mix-ups continue to happen elsewhere. In Canada in 2018, the identity of two junior hockey players was confused after a crash. It took 48 hours for the error to be recognized, and an apology was released by the Saskatchewan office of the chief coroner. For Sirach in particular, the mix-up has led to some surreal moments. She spoke about the event and its legacy at the 10-year memorial service for the crash victims at Taylor University. A lot of people wonder what people will say about you at your funeral. I know. Sirach told the gathered audience. Sirach also recalled some of the lighter things that people had said at her funeral, such as her sister adding in the eulogy that she didn't shower enough. Another eulogizer added how Sirach wasn't very good at sports. Yet, one of the darker moments Sirach has felt as a result of the crash and subsequent mix-up is something called survivor's guilt. Poignantly, the crash survivor also spoke about the family of Laura Van Ryn. The Van Ryns, they love me like I was their daughter because they believed that I was their daughter, Sirach reported. And even after I wrote Whitney and their world changed and they knew that I wasn't their daughter, they still treated me like I was their family, she added. Unsurprisingly, a bond is formed between the Sirachs and the Van Ryns. I love the Van Ryn family. They're so great, Sirach was reported as telling Today. In fact, the Sirach and Van Ryn families even collaborated on a book, Mistaken Identity, Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope, published by Howard Books and released in 2008. Sirach has grasped the chance at life she was afforded upon surviving the crash. She's now a married mother of 3, and in a strange quirk in 2010, she was married in the very same church where her funeral had been held just 4 years before. It was another surreal twist for the young woman and her family. It was such an unbelievable moment for us, because we were at the moment in our life when we thought this would never be a possibility, Newell Sirach, Whitney's father, told website The Huffington Post in 2012. In the face of such tragedy and loss, it's important to celebrate any happiness that survives.